Good morning and good yontiv. We're in Himshachayim Beis, lower, closer to the bottom of page 1218, Aleph Resh Yud Ches, and these pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along the text. Okay. So we've discussing the spectrum of the building blocks of existence, beginning from Keser Ani Rishon and concluding with Malchus Ani Acharon. These are the instruments, the tools, the divine instruments that God uses to create, beginning from the early stages of some form of superconscious awareness, which first is concealed, what he calls Isnasa Satzmi, that God is actually an elevated, transcendent entity in the context of a melech, beyond everything, not in context to creation, but just fundamentally in a different reality. But that itself has become now revealed. He called that the highest level in Keser, the revealed state of Isnasa Satzmi, connected it with Tainug, because there were two interpretations. Tainug being, again, a state of the highest state we can refer to, both in a human being and kavyachol, so to speak, in God. So first he said that Tainug is concealed, and then he said, he's talking about the revelation of Isnasa Satzmi, and in the parentheses he connected the two. He said it's inyan echad, because the Tainug b'melucha, the pleasure, that level of fulfillment that Tainug represents, is not about his snasus on an am. It's not as it relates to another. It's within himself. So therefore, the Tainug and the snasus go hand in hand. That leads to the next level, which is rotzen, an actual desire for melucha, and that will ultimately lead, even though he didn't spell it out now in these highest levels, chachma bina, but he spelled it out earlier. It'll lead to Malchus of Malchus, where there he calls it Shiur atzmei b'koyach, Goliv Galifu b'tihiri Allah, Beresh Hormonissa de Malka, which is referring to the beginning when of the desire, the Rotzen and the Rishus for Keser Malchus, all the way to in Malchus of Ein Sof, Malchus of Ein Sof, what he calls Goliv Galifu b'tihiri Allah, regarding visions, the actual details of what is to come. And that's where we stopped right there. So first comes the level of the Tainug or the Isnasus Atzmi. Rak mepnei is galus kavyachol the Isnasus Atzmi v'at Tainug b'melucha, and then the revelation of that. But from that comes the rotzen, the desire that no emlech, that I shall rule v'shir ba'atzmei. Not just that I shall rule, which is the rotzen, but then it leads all the way to Malchus of Ein Sof, which is that Shir ba'atzmei b'koyach, he said, where he allocates or envisions or estimates, not as an estimate, but so to speak, allocates the resources necessary to create, just like an artist who's determined what kind of art he wants. So now he actually begins to envision and reserve the necessary resources that will be for this piece of art. And the same is how kavyachol, so to speak, how it is above. So that's a review of what we learned. And we'll continue now. Now he's going to bring it back to Rishon Ani Acharon, which was the operative verse that's been being used throughout. He's going to sum it all up. At the end of this paragraph, then he goes back to Gan Eden, which is the topic that he began back on page 1213. So 5 pages back. So now let's learn inside. Inside, he says like this. The line begins, Bechinas Harotzen, page 1218, like 2/3 of the way down. It says, V'zehu, and this that we just described is Ani Rishon. This level of Keser Malchus is Hainu, Bechinas Keser Malchus. That's the level of Keser Malchus, where it all originates in the Keser, which we divided between Tainug and Rotzen, or Isnasus Atzmi and Rotzen. Okay, so he says like this. The ima yesh zel b'chinas eze is galus behelam ba'atzmei kavyachol, and here he combines both words, helam and gili. says, even though this state of Keser Malchus, this earliest state, is some form of revelation within himself, concealed within himself. In other words, it's not relating to anyone else, but it's some form of revelation to himself, some form of awareness, of cognizance. So till now, we've been learning Isnasus Atzmi. It's either concealed, even from the person himself, or it's revealed, but it's also to himself. So that's what he's talking about, the level that's revealed to himself, not to another. That's why it's Behelim Ba'atzmai. It's somewhat revealed, but only to himself. Not like Isnasus Alam is when the king is clearly showing and demonstrating that he's going to relate to the nation. You don't mean to have a nation yet, but he's already relating to the other. Here, it's all within himself. So even though there's some his galus, Behelim Ba'atzmai Kavyachol, nevertheless, how does that move the Ladayin, Legamri, Meklol Asiyah Shtalshlus? It's still complete, it's still removed, completely removed from the general structure of the Seder Shtalshlus. If you remember when he spoke about the difference between Rishon and Reishis, he said Rishon is Muvdal. It's separate from. It is already an entity in some extent, like he says, revealed somewhat to himself, but in context of Seder Shtalshlus, you can't yet call this Melech a Melech Ala'am. You can't say he's a creator of a creation. You could say within himself, he's manifested itself in a level of being a snasus, of an exalted, transcendent state. From there will originate the other levels. But right now, we're still in that removed level. So compared to higher than Keser Malchus, obviously, it's already some form of expression. But compared to lower, it's not yet, you can't call it the beginning of Seder Shtalshlus. You could say in it is going to be rooted, whatever's going to come is going to come from there, but it's not yet the beginning of a process. Okay. And this we learned earlier about Reishis and Rishon relatively at length. So this is that state. Mudlam, Ani Acharon, that's why it's Rishon. Ani Rishon, I am the first. Like we said earlier on top of page 1214, he spoke Rishon, he gave two interpretations. Either the Netzal HaRishon, the first emanation, or Rishon LeNetzalim, the first of the emanations. The different shitta between Ramak and the Arizal, we discussed that back on page 1214. But either way, it's a removed state. Question is how removed? According to the Arizal, it's very removed relatively because it's Atik. And Atik is removed, Netak, removed from. Okay. What's Vani Acharon? The second statement in the phrase, second part, the second phrase in this verse. This is Keser Malchus, is the crown of Malchus, meaning the highest sphere within Malchus. Remember, within Malchus, there's 10 spheres, so Keser is the highest. Malchus of Malchus is in Malchus, the lowest sphere of Malchus. What is that? Malchus and Malchus of Ein Sof, we're still talking before the Tzimtzum. But within the before the Tzimtzum, relatively speaking, the lowest level. But we've already said several times that he's allocating or envisioning within himself the actual details of Seder Shtalshlus. In Isnasus Atzmi of Keser Malchus, even though he may be aware of it, he's aware of it, but that's all that he's aware of, that he is in a transcendent state, an exalted state. It's Nasus, Malchus, Malchusdik. But it's not relating, he's not envisioning an Am, a nation, or a people, or an empire, or the details of what it is that he's going to ultimately rule over. And that, so this Malchus, Sheba Malchus, on the other hand, is Shiur Asmei B'Keyach. In the language of the Zohar, it's not just Rishus and Ratzon HaMelech, the permission and the desire of the king. It's Goliv Gelifu B'Tiri Elah. So that seems to be an action, but obviously it's metaphorical, that he actually engraved and he etched an engraving in this level called Tehiri Elah. That means there's already an envisioning of details. It's still within God's so-called super-conscious state. It's not yet a tzimtzum and a kav that will actually create, but within the mind, so to speak, if you want to call it a mind, within the consciousness of the divine, it's not just isnasas atzmi, it's actually have a relationship with existence. Now, I just want to reiterate something I've said a number of times, which may if just to refresh our memories. The fact that the Rebbe Rashab keeps making this point, begs the question, which we've answered, but I want to repeat it. Why is it so relevant to make this point? And let's say Isnasas Atzmi jumps immediately to creation, to existence, because remember, in the interface, we want to have the pure version of God as he is to himself. We don't just want a relationship with God as he relates to us. We want a relationship with God as he relates to himself. And then the interface also has to have a relationship with us, or else there's no interface. So this isn't just semantics and just saying that first the Melech is completely removed and then he gets more connected. It's actually critical because we really want to have a taste and experience of the divine as it is on his own, and then as he relates to the nation. So you have in the Melech both dimensions. The Melech as he is in his own inner sanctum, where he's in a transcendent state, not in relation with and in context and relative to the nation. And then there's how he relates to the nation. Now, of course, there's even higher levels than the divine. That's even before Isnasas Atzmi, like we spoke about. It's not even revealed at all, and levels and go on and on. But that's not the discussion here. So that's why this is an important point. It's not just as a matter of fact, just to let us know that there's two levels. It's negated to the whole picture of the proper interface. So ultimately, the beauty here is that we can actually connect ultimately even to God as he's removed from us. But that's the Aveda of going step by step. You can't just jump there. First, you have to relate to a God that relates to you, then you relate to God beyond. And again, all this is before the Tzimtzum. Okay. So that's Ani Acharon, the Shiur Atzmei B'Keach. And what happens next? Remember, we spoke about how Malchus of Atzilus is also, in microcosm, the same idea. Keser Malchus of Atzilus is still a relative Hisnasus Atzmi. And that comes into a Rotzen, Atik, and Arich, and a Chochmah, and Bina, and then it comes to Malchus. But remember, there was one thing that was mentioned there in a critical point on top of page 1216. What did he say? That you need to have one more thing, the Parsa. Because all this is fine within the divine itself. There's two levels. The divine as it relates to itself, the divine as it's envisioning existence. But you still don't have an existence because the intensity of the divine energy, even in the lower level, is still all divine. It's like the teacher has two levels. One as his mind is to himself, is brilliant, how he understands an idea unfiltered, the way he understands it himself. And then there's how he prepares himself to teach it to a student. But there still didn't happen, the teaching didn't happen yet. It's just a preparation. It's priming it. So now comes the Tzimtzum. Like there, the Parsha, the Tzimtzum. So now that Malchus of Ein Sof is in a state, relatively speaking, already relating. So it's more concealed than it is in Keser Malchus and in the higher levels. So like we learned, now there comes, here it's going to be called a Tzimtzum, not a Parsha. So he says, now the next step is, he says, Shaydeh HaTzimtzum. And now through the Tzimtzum, because through the Tzimtzum, Nasa b'chinas Keser v'atik la'ak. And through the Tzimtzum, this Malchus of Ein Sof will become Keser, the top, and Atik of Adam Kadmon, as we learned on top of the page, because the same process is happening on all levels. Malchus of a higher level becomes the Keser of the next level, but with the qualification of a concealment in between, because if not, you're not going to have a lower level. You want to have some form of concealment to allow the energy to flow to a lower level, but the same process continues step by every step of the way. Okay, and now the Rebbe Rashab adds, if you remember, at the top on page 1114, 1214 rather. I'm just referring to previous statements when he said Ani Rishon Ani Acharon. He says, what is the pasuk coming to say? Is it just coming to tell us that there's a Keser in the beginning and a Malchus at the end? or Keser Malchus and a Malchus of Malchus at the end? He's going to say no. Ani Rishon Ani Acharon, that the Rishon and Acharon have a relationship with each other. So we just said the relationship is the Malchus becomes Keser. And but in truth, Malchus is also rooted in the Keser above it. So that Keser Malchus of Ein Sof ultimately will wedge itself in Malchus of Ein Sof, which will then become Keser. So Malchus plays this dual role of being a Malchus, the end of the spheres, the immanent spheres, but also serving like a Keser, which is a transcendent dimension, a makif, as we've been discussing. So now he says like this. So he says, "V'notz tchilosan b'seifon v'seifon b'tchilosan." From the Sefer Yetzirah, the beginning is wedged in the end, and the end in the beginning. In other words, there's a unique relationship from the beginning of a process and the end of a process, even though there are many steps in between, but there's something about the two that have a deep relationship. I'll explain in a moment. I just want to spell it out here. That means that what? The B'chinas Malchus, the Malchus of the Ein Sof. The safe one, Ani Acharon, is safe, right? The end of the process, which is Malchus of Ein Sof, Shenase Keser La'ak. That becomes a Keser, a crown. In other words, the top level of Tainug and Ratzon for the next level. Shorshe Meb'chinas Keser Malchus, the Ein Sof. It is rooted in the Keser Malchus of Ein Sof. So what is the explanation for this? So we already learned. If that's the case, so why is it Acharon? It should be Keser Malchus. Keser goes to Malchus, and that's that. But we know in between is Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, 8 spheres in between. Or 9 spheres, depending how you count. Because at the end of the day, as we said, Keser is just a desire and a will. You still need a shaped creation. So though, yes, Malchus is already going to allocate, but it's like an artist can't just allocate and envision. He needs to first create a picture in his mind. So Chachma is the Nekuda. Bina shapes it. The Midas develop it further. So when it comes to Malchus, Malchus is working with something. It's not just I'm king. There's already a whole structure, but yet that's all in Giluyim. That's the Giluyim, the details of the structure, the process. Malchus, however, is the implementer that then implements that which was in the original Keser that wanted. It's like saying Keser says, I want a home, or I have a desire for a home. Okay, what kind of home? So Chachma through Yesod developed the design. Malchus takes all that and now says, I will now implement what the Ratzon wanted in the first place to build this home. That's where you'll have the details will actually be created now through Malchus, through going to the Parsa and to Bria. Or if you're talking about Lifnei Tzimtzum, the Malchus of Ein Sof is taking the Ratzon of Keser Malchus and the Tainug, is now going to implement it based on the details of the structure that was developed in the higher spheres. So on the level of Etzem, like he said on the page, this is, again, I keep referring back to pages because it's all relevant here. He said on the page, the bottom of page 14, I just want to read one line. He says, the Kol HaKeiches say na'ilei b'nefesh. They're all hanizgalus min hanefesh. Mashenke b'midas hamelucha. 5 lines from the bottom of 12:14. Achzeu b'gilui min hanefesh. That's when you're talking about the revelatory, the revelations from the nefesh. Aval be'etzem hanefesh, hine midas hamelucha mushresh be'etzem hanefesh yosem lekol hakeiches. Higher than all the faculties, because Malchus carries in it the DNA of the original Keser before the spheres became manifest. And that's why it will turn into the Keser for the next world and the next dimension. One more point I would make, we say every Friday night, Seif Maisa b'machshava tchila. The end, the Seif Maisa, the end of the action, the end of the product, the production is begins with machshava tchila. When you want a home, even though there's going to be many stages till the home is finally built, your intention is not the stages. Those are means to Seif Maisa. So Machshava Tchila, when someone looks at a beautiful mansion, you can rest assured it wasn't just built yesterday. It's not just a result of a process. It began in a Machshava Tchila of the architect or the creator, and this is the end product of what began in the beginning. All the steps in between were steps to get it done. So again, the connection of Seif Maisa, Machshava Tchila is similar to not Seifim B'Tchilas, but the beginning is wedged in the end, and the end in the beginning. Ani Rishon Ani Acharon. Now the truth is, in volume 2, earlier, a little more than 2/3 through the volume, there was a discussion the difference between Noah Seif Mitchalasan and Seif Maisa Machshava Tchila. It's not relevant to this discussion, but just in case you remember it, there is a difference between the two. But for our purposes here, what we now know is that Ani Rishon Ani Acharon is not just depicting two stages, the beginning and the end of the process, but also explaining how they interrelate with each other and manifest each other. They both are actually Malchus implementing Keser, and they really are Keser Malchus, and Malchus becomes Keser. So Malchus is rooted in the Keser Malchus. That's what he added now. So the pasuk is more than just stating a beginning and an end, but that the beginning and end are interconnected in this fashion. Okay. I'm going to stop in a few minutes I'm going to finish the paragraph, and then we'll stop for questions. And then he says like this. Now he's going back to the beginning of the page. Remember, this is the highest level, Malchus of Ein Sof, and Keser Malchus of Ein Sof, Malchus of Ein Sof. But then he's going to bring it back. What about all the levels lower? So he says, Val derech ze yuvim beproti protis, and similarly is understood in detail. When you break it down into details, b'chol elam v'elam. The Esesphere is the Abiyah. In each world, each of the lower worlds, of the 10 spheres of Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, Asiyah, the Mebchinas Malchus Shebe Elyon, that the Malchus from a higher level, Nasa Keser L'Tachten, becomes the Keser, the crown of the lower level. Malchus of Atzilus becomes the Keser of Bria. Malchus of Bria becomes the Keser of Yitzir, and so on. Kikol Sfira Klula Miyud, like we learned earlier, every sphere has encompassed within it all 10 spheres. So there's a Malchus within Chochmah. And there too, from that becomes the Keser to Bina. In other words, this is not just the Malchus of each world becomes the Keser for the next world, but the Malchus in each sphere too. Because every sphere encompasses all 10. Chochmah has Keser Sheba Chochmah all the way to Malchus Sheba Chochmah. So the Malchus of Chochmah becomes the Keser of Bina. So he's breaking it down even further, not just in the worlds, but also in the spheres. Umebina Lamidas, which he means is that the Malchus of Bina becomes the Keser for Midas. Ach derech klal, however, in general, when you speak in a more macrocosmic or general terms, Ani Rishon b'Malchus the Ein Sof. Ani Rishon is in the Malchus of Ein Sof, the highest Malchus before the Tzimtzum. Bechinas Malchus Cha, like he said on page 1214, the beginning of the paragraph. He says level of Malchus Cha Dafka, your Malchus, meaning the highest level of Malchus. In general terms, Malchus Cha. V'Ani Acharon. But Malchus da Atzilus ad Malchus da Asiyah. So now he's giving, I wouldn't say another interpretation, but another way of breaking it down, that in general, when you look at the whole Seder Shtalshus, you begin Ani Rishon. The Malchus the Ein Sof. In other words, the Keser, Malchus, Ani Rishon is within Malchus of Ein Sof, Malchus Cha, and Ani Acharon is in Malchus of Atzilus, which carries Keser of Atzilus, until you get to the end of Ishtalshlus, Malchus of Asiyah. So though in every level you have Malchus and Keser, that intricate connection, both that Malchus is rooted in Keser and becomes the Keser of the next level, it also, in general terms, he says we begin with Malchus of Ein Sof, go to Malchus of Atzilus, and to Malchus of Asiyah. Now he's not ignoring Keser. He's assuming we understand that he means that Ani Rishon, that we said before, Ani Rishon is Keser, Ani Acharon is Malchus. So now, interestingly, he's translating it in context that Ani Rishon is the first level of Malchus, which of course is not a contradiction because it means it also includes Keser Malchus. But he is interpreting it now that Ani Rishon in general is referring to the first level of Malchus, which becomes Keser of Ak, and Ani Acharon is referring to Malchus of Atzilus, to the point all the way to Malchus of Asiyah. So it is a little different interpretation, but not in Havana. It's not a contradiction in understanding. It's just the way he defines Ani Rishon v'Ani Acharon, that you can say Ani Rishon v'Ani Acharon means Keser and Malchus. You could also say it means the highest level of Malchus, which becomes Keser and is rooted in Keser, and the lower levels of Malchus in Atzilus and all the way to Asiyah. So no contradiction. It's not a new interpretation. It's just another way of explaining the pasuk using Malchus instead of using Keser and Malchus. But he clearly says that. Ani Rishon, he says Malchus b'Malchus the Ein Sof. It's interesting. He says b'Malchus the Ein Sof. He doesn't say Malchus the Ein Sof. He says it's in Malchus of Ein Sof. Ani Acharon b'Malchus the Atzilus. That in other words, that I am there, that God resides there, that level of godliness resides there. Okay. So now he concludes the paragraph. V'zehu ru'u ato. Ru'u ato ki ani anihu. So the pasuk says that I, and it says the word I twice. What's the significance of saying, see today, behold now? Behold now. Ki ani anihu. I am I, basically. So he says, the Ani Acharon, the latter Ani is the Malchus Asiyah. And when he says, who? Ani, anihu, he says, the Ani Acharon, Malchus Asiyah. Who? Ani Rishon, the Malchus the Ein Sof. The pasuk is saying, Ki ani anihu, that the Ani, which is Malchus of Ein Sof, is Anihu. It's the same and connected with and one with Ani Rishon of Malchus Ein Sof. I'm sorry. That Ani, the Malchus of Asiyah, I said it the wrong way. Ani Acharon, the Malchus of Asiyah is who? Ani Rishon, the Malchus the Ein Sof. It's the same thing as the level of Malchus of Ein Sof. Why? The notes because the beginning is wedged in the end and the end in the beginning. So he clearly has moved, instead of talking about Keser and Malchus, he's moved from Malchus to Malchus. Again, it doesn't change the understanding of it, but the reason he's doing that, my assumption is because he wants to speak about it now in terms of how it relates to existence. At the lowest level of Malchus and Asiyah is Ani. And that Ani, Anihu, is who? The Ani of Ani Rishon of Malchus of Ein Sof, because the beginning is wedged in the end and the end in the beginning. Okay. I believe that we'll understand the more details when we go on. Rabbi Rashab is laying the groundwork here. And finally, he says one more statement. Ulagabi atzmus ein sof. We talked about a tzimtzum. Compared to Atzmus Ein Sof, because you can ask a question now. 1 second. Ani Rishon Ani Acharon. What do you mean? There's a big tzimtzum in between. Malchus of Ein Sof is before the tzimtzum. Malchus of Asiyah is all the way to the end of the process. So he says like this, because compared to Atzmus Ein Sof, looking from the top, how the Eibishter sees it all, Ein atzimtzum arishon shalifnei atzilus v'tzimtzum ha'achron shalifnei bri v'yitzira master klal v'klal. So compared to Atzmus Ein Sof, the core of Ein Sof, the tzimtzum addition before Atzilus. In other words, after Malchus of Ein Sof, the tzimtzum Acharon. So the tzimtzum addition would be the tzimtzum and Ani Rishon of Malchus of Ein Sof. And the Tzimtzum Achron would be the Tzimtzum Ani Acharon of Malchus of that follows Bria Yetzira, compared to the Eibush to Atzmos Ein Sof, Ein Master Klal V'Klal. It doesn't cover up or conceal at all. So in other words, when we're looking from our perspective, obviously all these levels are states of concealment. We said Malchus conceals, doesn't reveal. But from the point of view of the Eibishter, Ani Rishon Ani Acharon, it's all, there's no concealment. So therefore, their levels can be completely connected with each other. It's going to take our avodah to reveal them. But he's adding here that from God's point of view, from the Atzmos Ein Sof point of view, there's the Tzimtzum Rishon before Atzilus and the Tzimtzum Achron before Bria V'Yetzira, meaning after Atzilus, does not conceal or cover up at all. Now again, he doesn't explain why he's saying it, but my understanding is that when we start learning further, all this will come together, we'll understand the picture. So there's a few points that Rebbe Rashab added here. First of all, he moved it, Ani Rishon Ani Acharon, to speak about Malchus, the highest level of Malchus and the lowest level. And secondly, he added this point about that the Tzimtzum does not conceal in relation to Atzmos Ein Sof, the core of Ein Sof, from above. But to sum it all up, bottom line is, what we learn now is that Ani Rishon Ani Acharon is these two higher levels, Keser Malchus and Malchus. The same thing is throughout the whole Hishtalshelus, even down to every sphere. And the conclusion that the lowest level of Malchus is wedged and connected to the highest level of Malchus of Ein Sof. So when God envisioned creation in the superconscious Lifnei HaTzimtzum reality, ultimately there's something about that Malchus of Asiyah in the lowest levels can relate to. So it will carry over, and from God's point of view, it was not really concealed. It's just from the recipient's point of view, it's concealed. So you can say in the lowest levels of Malchus that relate to our existence, in concealed within there, wedged within, is the highest levels of God envisioning existence itself. And that's the relationship. So it's not just God's envisioning it from the sky, from a bird's eye view, but he's embedded it into the level of Malchus in each level of Ishtalshelus, all the way to the lowest level. Which of course
like all
is
the
vital,
stream are connected.
it's vital because that's vital because that means we can access it ultimately through our avodah, through work. But it means it's not off limits, basically. That's the key thing to remember when you say that Tzimtzum doesn't conceal from above, is basically saying it's there, God put it there, but now it's our work. But it's work that we can achieve because it's not removed, it's just concealed. And ultimately, that's what we want to reveal is the highest levels of Malchus Ein Sof, even before the Tzimtzum, because God himself envisioned existence, even though it's not yet in an active way, but in the highest levels before the Tzimtzum, he envisioned existence, which resulted from the Ratzon and higher the Tainug, all the way to Isnasus Atzmi, all the way pre-Tzimtzum. So that sums up what we learn now. So now I'll stop. Any questions, clarity, I'll be happy to elaborate.
It's like all the Malchus is all connected. We learned that all the Keser is connected with each other.
Yep. Correct. Malchuscha Malchus Kol Elamim. Your kingship, we learned on page 1214. Your kingship is the kingship of all the world. So that's what he said. That Malchuscha Malchus Kol Elamim, Kol Ikar Malchus Elmis is Malchus. Malchus of Ein Sof is the root of all the levels of Malchus throughout the whole cosmic order. Who mocked the Malchus the Kol Elamim shebishtalshus the Abiyak, Malchus the Ak, or Malchus the Atikemen, V'Abba V'Ima, V'Zah, Ad Malchus the Atzilus, or Malchus the Bria, Ad Malchus the Asiyah. I'm reading from page 1214. Shumadrega Yesha Trachtena Lahavas Elam Ashofa Shalanu. V'Zeu Pirish Melech Malchi Amlochim Shalamayel the Abiyah Shakol Nimshach B'chinis Malchuscha. When he started the whole thing, he began on page 1214. He made the statement exactly what we just learned now. So it's all tied together. This concludes this section. Anyone wants to speak up? No? Okay.
Rabbi, I have a question to ask you, and I'm not sure if it even relates to this or not. I always understood, as you just mentioned it today, the Sof Maaseh B'Machshava Techila. I read it somewhere, and I can't remember the source, that when that happened for the Eibishter, obviously he's above time and space, but it was as if it was Shabbat afternoon if you were to give it a time. So would that relate to the level of the tainuk, the inner pleasure that you'd say that's within the Eibishter, even before it's revealed? Could that be in the spirit of Shabbat? Like that's really what it's talking about when you talk about tainuk?
Yes, absolutely. In Kabbalah, it says that there was a Shabbos before creation. So conceptually, Shabbos is the Vayichulu Hashemayim. Remember, Shabbos is the completion of the purpose of creation. The 6 days of the week is meant to create a mundane world in order to elevate it to Shabbos. So Shabbos is wedged right away in the beginning. As soon as God begins creation, Shabbos is in his mind, if you wish. So yes, you can say that's like the level of Keser Malchus that precedes it all. It's similar like the pasuk in Bahar, in chapter Bahar in Vayikra. So the pasuk begins, Kisavoy ela oretz v'shofsa ha'oretz Shabbos la'Hashem. That when you'll arrive to the land, you shall rest the land Shabbos to Hashem. And then the pasuk continues, Sheishanim tizur sadecha, Sheishanim tizmer karmecha. 6 years you shall plant and sow your fields. 6 years you shall plant your vineyards. And then again it says, Shana Hashvi is Shabbos la'Hashem. And the 7th year should be Shabbos la'Hashem. So the question is asked, Alter Rebbe asks, L'kutei Torah, it's redundant. You know, you already said, if since you say it at the end, why do you have to say in the beginning, Shav Sa'ar Shabbos la'Hashem? And more importantly, first they did Shemitah or first they worked 6 years? The answer is they first worked 6 years. So the order should have began. The pasuk should say, when you come to the land, when you arrive to Eretz Yisrael, 6 years you shall work your land, your earth, and the 7th year will be Shabbos. So the Alter Rebbe explains the pasuk begins because it right away Seif Ma'asav Machshava Tchila wants to tell us the purpose of why you're going to work the land. That from day one, you already have in mind the Shabbos. Like the Ramban says that the mitzvah of Zocher Shem Shabbos is not just on Shabbos. It's all week long, thinking that everything I'm doing through the week is for Shabbos. There's two opinions. How Shammai and Hillel, Shammai would actually put aside, if he found a good piece of food, he'd put it aside for Shabbos from Sunday. Hillel would do that on Friday. But that's another discussion. But everybody agrees that Shabbos is the neshama of the whole week. That's why the tainug of Shabbos, which is the end of the process of creating from the material world, Adira b'tachtenim, a home for God, begins is wedged right in the beginning of Keser Malchus. Yes. Okay, good. Any other? No? Okay. So I'm ready to move on. Let's continue learning. So now that we've done this whole review, this whole discussion, elaborate discussion, that began on page 1213, which was about Rishon Ani Acharon, Keser Malchus, Keser Sheba Malchus, Malchus Sheba Malchus. Like we learned now, the whole thing that ultimately the pleasure or the tainug, all the way to the highest levels of tainug, like he said, higher than the Ratzon, connected with his Nasis Atzmi, is ultimately wedged in the Malchus of Malchus. And Malchus of Ein Sof is ultimately wedged in Malchus of Asiyah. This is going to now help us understand Gan Eden, the role of Gan Eden. Because remember, Gan Eden, as we learned, and just refresh our memories from back page, Gan Eden is different than the existence. The world was created, God created Bereshis bara l'kimas hashamayim v'saaretz. He created a whole heaven and earth. 6 days, he created all the different creations in all parts of the earth. Then comes on day 6, the creation of Gan Eden. Gan Eden is a special creation. Like he says. I'm sorry, where he speaks at the top of page Shem Mole, where he speaks, let's see here, Vayinichahu, Kol Eitz Gan Eden. Just want to get the exact language. So both on page, here we are. So I just want to refresh. So he says like this. Vayita Havaya Lekim Gan Eden. God planted a garden in Eden. Shenema Shem Ole Havaya and Elikim. So in the world itself, Gan Eden is a higher level of Elikus. What he called before the Gilead of Atzilus in Bria. And the question he asked was, 1 minute, from Atzilus to Bria, you need a parsa, you need a tzimtzum. And this began the long explanation of what we just learned. So you could already begin to guess what the answer is going to be. That Gan Eden gives us a taste, a pre-tzimtzum taste of God's pleasure, of Tainug from the highest levels. Because Gan Eden, as we learned, is a result of our Avodah, the Avdel Shamra. That through our Avodah, so Gan Eden has its own particular revealed state, but then it's our Avodah that will increase taste for Seiris, which was the whole discussion about reward. So now, once we've established this whole shtalshlus of Keser and Malchus and all the levels, from one level to the next, and how it travels, and we've also established that the whole purpose of existence is ultimately the fulfillment of God's Tainug in Torah mitzvahs of Neshamas Yisrael. And a Dir B'Tachtenim, this will now set the stage that help us understand what exactly is Gan Eden and its role. Okay, so just keep in mind all these details. Now it's going to start emerging the picture, the answer, and explanation to it all. And now we'll understand why the Rebbe Rashab needed this whole elaboration in the first place. Okay, so he says like this. And now we need to understand what is the inyan of Gan Eden in this whole process. This is a classic example of how Chassidus explains things. And I just want to share it because it's really amazing. It teaches you to think very differently. The Rebbe Rashab could have easily told us 5 pages ago, Atzilus and Bria, he could have said, because Gan Eden brings a gili that's higher than the regular shtalshlus, regular structure. But he didn't do that. He went back to the beginning. Because the real question is, when you say Atzilus can't go into Bria, the question is, why not? The answer is because for Bria to exist as an independent, conscious entity, it would become completely absorbed and dissolve and annihilated in the face of Atzilus. So then the next question is, so why then create Bria in the first place? The answer is because God wants a dir b'tachtein. So the truth is, everything we just learned is all going back. Before we talk about Gan Eden and Atzilus and Bria, we have to understand why were they created in the first place. And the answer is, it's all because the Tainug for Melucha, the Tainug for the Isnasus Atzmi, that the divine, in his own mysterious way, without understanding the reason, has an Esava Kadosh Baruch Hu, a Tainug, in a world that is going to be Tachtenim, an Am. He wants an Am, a nation. That's not an extension of himself. To do that, you're going to need a dual effect. On one hand, you need to have distance and concealment, as we learned, which is what Malchus does. On the other hand, you need to have some revelation, or else you have no relationship. So this whole process that first comes is Nasus Atzmi, that there's a God that you can talk about at least as being exalted and transcendent. Up to that point, God is altogether off limits. So at least he's now manifest in the world called Hisnasus. It's Hisnasus Atzmi. It's all on God's terms. And from there will come a ratzon, a desire for Melucha, meaning for a nation, or we talk to a home, a world, existence. And from there will be shaped until it comes to Malchus of Malchus, that'll envision the details, and that will already begin the Hisnasus Ala'am, that is beginning to see himself as a king over the, meaning relating to existence. And then will come a Tzimtzum. And then all the rest of the steps then you have yourself a whole picture that now you could say we have now the landscape, if you wish, a canvas upon we can understand how God's plan and kavanah, intention, is being fulfilled. Now we can go back and let's talk about Gan Eden. Now, why is this so eloquent? Because usually when people talk about Gan Eden, okay, you know what? Neshama lives its life in this world. After 120 years, it passes on. It goes to Gan Eden and learns Torah all day. Beautiful. But if someone said to you, what's the purpose of that? Why is that happening? What's the role? So it comes down to, okay, it's reward for our work. Chassidus doesn't go that way. Chassidus wants to understand, what does God need the whole thing for in the first place? And that's what we're coming away with. So now when we learn about Gan Eden, when we come back to Gan Eden, it's going to be informed by the big picture of the whole purpose of existence, from the highest levels to the lowest levels. Then we could understand, where does Gan Eden fit into the map? That's one of the eye-opening features of Chassidus. Even though it focuses on details, but it will very often go back to the big vista, the panorama of everything, the whole picture. You want to understand Atzilus? First understand the whole purpose, then you can understand that part of the map. So we're getting a picture of the whole map, then we can now zero in on each piece and say, let's deal with it. Think of it like a mechanic that's operating on an automobile or any appliance or a complex machine. A real mechanic is not just an expert on one gear or on one spring or on one piece of the appliance. He understands the whole thing, how it should work. And then you go in and start fixing each detail. So Chassidus gives that big picture of how the whole thing works. And once you know that, you go back and understand each part of this blueprint or map completely new and fresh way, and you have a full, much broader understanding of it. Thought it was important to give this introduction because it's like jumps in front of your face when you read it. The elaboration of an introduction to get back to an answer on Gan Eden, which you could say, it could easily be answered in a few lines. But that's not what the kavanah is. You really understand the whole role of it, the whole purpose. And that, of course, is a far broader picture because you're not just getting one piece of the puzzle, you're getting the whole puzzle. Okay. So he says like this. Now we have to understand what is the inyan of this Gan Eden in the context of everything we just learned. Because now, the primary thing that the souls are benefiting and enjoying, the reflection of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence in Gan Eden, which is the main feature of Gan Eden, that the Gan Edens radiate the divine presence. In this world, you cannot say that. It's not radiating, it's concealed. You can access it. And the work we do achieves even more than they do in Gan Eden. But what's the role of Gan Eden? He says, it's primary. Primary because we said, remember, Gan Eden exists even without Avodah. So he says, that primary thing that neshamas benefit from the divine, from the reflection of the divine presence, the primary role of Gan Eden, of the neshamas having that benefit, is created by, is manufactured and generated through the good deeds that we do in this world. In other words, it's not just some vacation spot that people travel to hang out in. It's produced and generated by the good deeds we do in this world. So though, yes, there's a Gan Eden, as we learned, on a lower level, on a minimal level, that's still a special part of the earth before Adam and Chava came into it. But then it says, L'avdol l'shamra, you're here to serve and protect and make this garden grow, thrive, and blossom. That's through Avodah. So where's the Avodah happen? That's the Maisim Tevim we do in this world. We already learned this earlier, but he's going back now and putting it into the context that we need to understand it fully. Shezeu gamken inya shamar Razal. This is also what Razal say, that our rabbis, the sages, say, schar mitzvah mitzvah. This again we learned earlier, that the reward for a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. Because seemingly you'd say schar mitzvah, you do a mitzvah, I'll give you money. You do a mitzvah, I'll give you spiritual reward. To say the mitzvah itself is the reward, which is the mission in Pirkei Avos, what does that mean? So he says, so in Tanya he says, schar mitzvah mitzvah, because a mitzvah releases Eir Ein Sof, it releases divine energy. When you do a mitzvah, you're releasing the divine energy, which is your reward. It's a direct result of your action. It's not a side reward, like a student is learning in school, so the teacher will give him a candy. The candy has nothing to do with the learning. It's just a symbolic gesture of appreciation, of value. The schar mitzvah mitzvah, the mitzvah itself is schar. He says like this, the reward and the pleasure in Gan Eden, it's actually a product, a result of the oir, of the ha'ara, of the oir generated, or the reflection from the mitzvah itself. So when we do a mitzvah right now, you reach out to someone in need, you give them a coin for tzedakah, or you put on film, or you eat kosher, whatever mitzvah it is, we may not see or feel its direct, immediate impact on the world around us, even though it impacts the world, but our eyes are just limited. They don't see it. But in Gan Eden, something happens. In Gan Eden, an Ur is generated. And remember, Gan Eden is not up there. It's right here. It's a different dimension. Something is generated, and that itself is the schar. V'zeu shekosov, and this is what it says, Vayinichehu b'Gan Eden la'ovda l'shamra. This is what it says. Again, many of these words we learned already, but it doesn't matter because the Rebbe Rashab again is tying it all together here. Just wanted to see, where did he say schar mitzvah mitzvah? I'm looking at pages now 12, 11, 12, 12, where the topic began. Yeah. Okay. So it says he placed Adam into the garden to la'avda l'shamra, to serve and protect it. And what does that mean? As we learned, la'avda is ramach mitzvah sesa, shamra is the la'avda, to serve is the 248 positive mitzvahs. The shamra, to protect, is the 365 negatives. So he says, the mitzvahs esa, when through the aveda, the work, the effort, in positive mitzvahs, oisin as a Gan Eden. You actually create Gan Eden. You don't create the very matter of Gan Eden. That was created beforehand, but you're creating it into becoming a place that's filled with divine delights, divine pleasure, divine presence. Hainu shemam shichim, which means that you're drawing down the reflection of the divine presence, Shechina, for the person to benefit from it. So let's talk physically, like he said on page 1211. You come, let's say you inherit a garden. You buy a home, or your parents give you a home. In the home, there's a garden outside. And you go out to the garden is has some flowers, maybe has fruits, whatever it may be. Now, if you don't take care of it, the garden will begin to be overgrown, and the flowers and the fruits will begin to shrivel and wither. You, as the gardener, your role is to go, you hoe the garden, you sow it, you water it, you plant it, you water it, you make sure you do everything possible to irrigate it, to make sure it's working well. There's the second half. You weed it and get rid of any toxic or pollutants, whether it's weeds or it's insects or whatever it may be that may destroy or deteriorate the very garden. And what do you get as a result? You will get a beautiful garden that will produce, and let's talk about a garden that has all the produce, beautiful fruits, beautiful flowers, delicious fruits, a whole abundance of food that you can take and partake from and enjoy, obviously, all the Shem Shemayim. That's the physical sense. Says the same thing, schar mitzvah mitzvah. When we do a good deed in this world, that's like working the garden. You're taking the earth, you're working it, planting it, nurturing it, and the result in Ruchnius, the equivalent of flowers and beautiful fruit, is the Shechina, that is the Gilia Lakus of the divine presence that you are generating that you can then benefit from. So does the garden have the capacity even before you enter? It has the potential. Does it also have something special even before you do work? It does, like we learned. But the real benefit, that's why he said, Iker. Iker in Yamasha Neshamis Nenin. The primary benefit comes as a direct result of your efforts and work in the garden. And that is an example for, or a way of explaining Gan Eden, why it's called the Garden of Eden. And its benefits are coming through our work directly. It's not two separate things that you do the work and God throws you a few candies or throws you this shechina. Your work itself is producing and drawing down and generating elokus. Okay. And I think I'm going to stop here simply because I have to stop somewhere. It's not like the subject is over, but we'll stop here at the last line. But before we conclude, let's get any clarity. Remember, the Rebbe Rashab is building up the case now. He hasn't by any means answered the question yet, but he's going to take everything we learned and now explain it through the context of Gan Eden and our Avodah and the schar that we get for the Avodah and the benefits and so on. But
I wanted to ask a question to understand the inyan of Gilui or by our Avodah and our mitzvahs and Masim Tovim. So we talk about it. There's a Gilui of or basically or habligvul in this world, basically revelation of godliness in this world, and that is the effect, if you will, of our work, of our observing mitzvahs, masim tovim, doing good deeds, and that's the hamshacha. There's a hamshacha of or from bligvul to into this world. But on the one hand, on the other hand, we're saying there's a hamshacha of or ziva shchina into Gan Eden. So my question is not so much which is it, but how do these two things relate to each other? These two hamshachot, if you will, hamshachos.
Yeah. So first of all, as a teacher, I would recommend that you and everybody in the class should try to speak in total English. You'll understand the ideas a lot better. As soon as you start using Hebrew, even I, who know the Hebrew well, begin to wonder what do you even mean. Maybe you're not even understanding the words you're using. I'm not challenging that. Maybe you do, but when you say in English,
would you like me to restate the question in English?
Next time you can do it. It's fine.
I understand my question very well. When we do,
yeah, but I don't know. When I hear you, I don't know if you're just using words from the Maimorim or you actually understand them in a simple English term. So you don't have to do it now.
Well, why don't I do it just so for the benefit of people listening? I'll ask the question again in English without using any word, without using any Hebrew. I'll try anyways. So we understand by observing mitzvahs, doing good deeds, that we are drawing down divine light. We're basically making this world, this physical world, a dwelling place for God by revealing godliness in this world. And that godliness is a light, if you will, that we draw down from above higher worlds, let's say even that's not in this world, but say from a higher world like Atzilus or Bligvul that we talked about for quite a while in the prior Chalak Bet, chapter 2. So that when we are doing our work here, davening, doing mitzvahs, good deeds, that we're going to draw down light from above it, and that's what creates the dira, the dwelling place for God in this lower world. That we're drawing down the light, we're revealing the light in this world. Okay, on the one hand. On the other hand, we're saying in Gan Eden, so too, when we do a mitzvah, that we are drawing down a light, the ziva shchina, the reflection of the shchina, which is light, into Gan Eden. So those are two different types of drawing down. One is into this world and one is into Gan Eden. And so my question is not which is it. My question is, how do these two drawing downs? One is the drawing down into this world and the other is a drawing down into Gan Eden. And my question is, how are these two drawing downs, hamshachos, related, if at all? Okay, there. Did I say that okay in English?
you said the best that you could on your end. The thing that's missing here, which I did explain when we began learning Gan Eden, and I'll just repeat or elaborate a bit. There is no world called Gan Eden or Garden of Eden in heaven. Gan Eden is right here. When we say we're drawing energy, when we generate energy through a mitzvah, you don't see it in this world right now. So yes, we believe it's here. Where is it so-called stored? That's called Gan Eden. Gan Eden is essentially the storage of the energy that we generate through a mitzvah. There's no two different entities here. The only difference is that it's not revealed to us, so it's called. That's why I wanted the English, because the real English should say the following, and I'll translate it into English that's not even using the word Gan Eden. When you do a mitzvah right now, you take an object, a neutral object, a piece of food, kosher piece of food, you make a blessing on it, and you use the energy to do a good deed. Or you take a coin or a dollar and you give someone charity. What you've done is, you haven't just done a good deed, you've also generated energy. But you don't see that energy. It's just like we know that everything in matter gives off energy. In physics, the rule is that no matter, nothing can disappear. You burn a piece of wood, it turns into heat and gas that doesn't disappear. It just cannot visible to the eye. And then it dissipates from our eye, but it's out there somewhere. So the same thing, spiritually speaking, we generate energy when we do something. Now, where's that energy? Our physical eyes don't see it. So what we're told is that it's stored in a level. The level happens to be called Gan Eden. Gan Eden is a dimension where that energy is stored. And now when a neshama doesn't have a body, and it's not limited vision like we have right now, the soul can benefit from it. There are people who live in this world that can also benefit from it because they're more spiritual. So spirituality is simply a state that's here that we don't experience. So Gan Eden is a name for a level of where that energy gets generated, and that's where the souls experience it. As I said, in this world, sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. So it's not two different dimensions. It's all based on the work we do here. And frankly, it generates energy not just in Gan Eden, also on other levels. Gan Eden is the main place where we talk about the neshama benefiting, the neshama benefiting from the work done, its own work done in this world. And that's the schar mitzvah. You do a mitzvah. What is the reward? Divine energy. Where is that stored? Gan Eden. Sometimes the example is given for a treasure that's munach b'kufsa, a treasure that's put into a treasure chest. You don't see it because it's in the chest, but it's being stored there until the day comes when Mashiach comes. And the day comes when all the energy will erupt and the whole world will physically see that which was there already. So the world has become transformed. When the Rebbe says, open your eyes, what does it mean? It means that the fact that there are political changes in the world, political freedoms, the advancements of technology, certain things that no one could have imagined, the eradication of certain things that once upon a time no one could imagine. These are glimpses and glimmers coming from Gan Eden and from higher worlds, meaning deeper worlds, I should say, where that spiritual energy has manifest and it's already affecting the world, that the world is a more refined place. The ultimate revelation will be when Mashiach comes and the future, when all this will become seamlessly seen and experienced by us. But at this point, we call it Gan Eden for that reason.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? Always we'll conclude here. So the last line on page 1218, we shall stop here.